Okay. Enjoy yourself at AnimeFest?
I have to say, from what I've been able to see of it, alas, I haven't been able to attend as much as I'd like. Things are going very well this year, and people are having a lot of fun.
Okay, yeah. Now let me see. You're with the Lunar Project, right?
I am the well-known man who wants to go to the moon, as I appeared in the 2012 movie Lunar Sea, actually, among other things. I have in the past actually occasionally had a display here at AnimeFest, but not this year. I could have had, because I was able to attend, but it was not something that I arranged in advance for. But I might do it next year. You never know.
Okay, what do you think about this guy that wants to send people on a one-way trip to Mars?
Well, my opinion about Mars One is that conceptually, it's reasonably sound. As I've said, my opinion is you've got to establish a settlement someplace before you have regular commerce back and forth. You don't build a transcontinental railroad until you have the city of San Francisco at the other end. The problem is really in the logistics. Nobody's ever been to Mars, right?
Right.
A dozen people have been to the moon. Nobody's ever been to Mars. The difference is a 3-day trip to the moon versus a 9-month trip to Mars, a trip you can take any day of the month versus a trip you can take once every 26 months when the stars are right. And as you can imagine, the biggest single issue here is just that you need an immensely larger quantity of supplies, not just to tide you over between shipments or whatever, because there are some things you're not going to be able to produce yourself, and no matter how much you work at developing that capability. And again, that's something we're better prepared to do on the moon than on Mars, because we've brought back samples, we've studied them, we have an idea of the mineralogy and how to work with it, but also it's the supplies to carry you over in case of the unexpected. Because frankly, if it's going to be 35 months that you're out on the far end before any conceivable help could reach you, then you've got to be prepared for almost anything that could possibly happen, which means a truly immense quantity of emergency supplies of every conceivable description. Whereas if it's a much shorter trip, to then, even accounting for the time it takes to prepare a rocket, prepare a payload, and so on, you don't have to pack everything that you can conceivably imagine. You pack the most likely stuff you're going to need, and then if something really off the wall happens, and again, this is a real advantage, you phone home. Because, of course, it's only a second and a quarter each way between the Earth and the Moon by radio, whereas it can be as much as 30 minutes to reach Mars. Again, that's in fact, more than that, it's a real liability. So as I say, I don't have a problem with Mars One in principle, but what they're proposing to do would, I think, be a real blow if it were to actually happen, because there's almost no way that they would be successful, and a failure would be very, very bad for the whole space movement. And this is something I always say, I'm in favor of people doing a lot of different projects, but I'm also very, very aware that any failures that occur cast doubt on the whole enterprise, because we're not a bunch of separate individual projects. We are, in a way, an ecosystem. All of us, and I count myself in that bucket. I count the nice folks at X-Corps and SpaceX and Orbital Sciences in that bucket, the National Space Society, which I was recently a director of, the Moon Society, which I've recently been elected a director of, and so on. There's a whole ecosystem of, and NASA as well. I mean, frankly, the things like the withdrawal after the end of Apollo, things like the Challenger accident, things like the Columbia accident, really did affect even non-American space projects. Because anytime that there's a real marquee failure, if you want to put it that way, everybody whatever they're doing gets a second look taken at it.
Yeah, I understand. I used to work at a company, and they made landing gear for aircraft, and they made it for the space shuttle, and they were also working, and the project I was working on was for the X-33 Venture Star, which got canceled after I left the company.
Yeah, that's also been a chronic problem, is projects which get 2/3 or 3/4 of the way towards completion and then get canceled at that point. And the thing is, then things, in many cases, not only the way that the projects are structured, there's no way for someone else to come in and continue from that point. You have to start again from zero. We've had too many cases of starting again from zero, which is why the proposals I've made are all intended to build on hardware which is out there in the wild right now, or is very close to it. In fact, my current baseline proposal for an early lunar mission, dear God, Gumby in an Akatsuki cloak. Anyway, sorry. My current baseline, there's an escalator and there's people coming down in all kinds of insane costumes. My current baseline proposal for a lunar mission.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Talk about your unhealthy crossovers. Anyway, but yeah, my current baseline proposal contemplates using the Falcon Heavy, which is a rocket which SpaceX plans to launch in the spring of next year, and a modernized Gemini capsule, which is already being built by a group of folks out in Alabama, among other major components. So again, it's not a case of having to start from scratch. There's a lot more than that to begin with. And again, because we're going to the moon, which unlike the space station, for example, you don't have the problem of weightlessness. Tools and so forth actually behave the way you expect them to, and so there are a lot of things that are already in use on Earth that we can either directly use or we can adapt with really a minimum, at least for the early stages. Now, in the more distant stages in the future, we're going to want to do much more ambitious things. But right at the beginning, we want to do as little that's ambitious as we can possibly help. And this is one of those things that the lunar environment makes possible, because again, you bring the stuff you think will work, and if it breaks down and you can't fix it or modify it, you can get something else sent to you pretty quickly.
That's what they kind of remind me like the Mir space station the Russians had. It was actually scheduled for about, I think, 5 years or 7 years. Then they extended it for quite a bit of time, and they kept retrofitting everything.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
And that was, to me, that was a good experiment to tell you how you can make a spaceship last longer.
Yeah,
for something that was not designed to stay up there that long.
Yeah, we have seen, not only have we seen that NASA's planetary probes often get their missions extended for years, but we've also seen, as with the Mir, and even to an extent with the ISS, that with space platforms, which are sort of a destination that you can go to, it's possible to replace parts as they fail, or to at least add new parts to take over the job of ones that are not working properly. In fact, the funniest thing currently is that the U.S. side and the Russian side of the International Space Station share nothing in common. The electricity voltages and the way the grounding works, for example, are totally different, and their water systems are also not interconnected, which has the interesting spectacle of the Russians actually taking bags full of wastewater and hauling them over to the U.S. side to be dumped into the U.S. water repurification system. Because the U.S. system takes everything, condensation from the air, waste, wash water, and even urine, and breaks it down electrically and separates it into two components. One is pure water, or even just hydrogen and oxygen. To a certain extent, that's where they get their breathing air. They use the oxygen, dump the hydrogen overboard, and then a concentrated brine solution, which is then discarded when they dump the used Progress resupply modules. So the Russians, however, have a shower, which the U.S. side doesn't. And so the Russians take their used shower water and put it in great big bags and carry it over to the American side, because they don't have the facilities for recycling it on their side.
Sounds like they have to work in the future of, standardizing everything.
Yes, it's absolutely the case that progress in the future does depend on things like standardization of interfaces, and there are actually high-level conferences going on among industrial and government leaders even now. But the problem is nobody wants to commit to a standard when things are still fairly early on, and everybody's convinced that they're going to have some great idea in the next year or two that'll make all existing standards obsolete. It's like with wireless networking. You got two kinds of wireless networking. You got the stuff that's not standardized at all, and then you've got these standards which include every possible option. And neither of those is a really desirable outcome. And so a lot of the working groups, for example, with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, are concerned with trying to figure out when is the right time to standardize. And unfortunately, particularly because you've got government entities that don't have to work with each other if they don't want to, we haven't reached that point yet. Now, on the commercial side, it is more standardized because everybody wants to be able to compete for customers. And so if you launch a communications satellite, there are 2 or 3 different ways it can be bolted down, and those are pretty much to the rocket, and those are pretty much standard across the industry, because Ariane Space and the folks who launched the Proton and SpaceX and United Launch Alliance all want to be able to launch your satellite and want to be able to offer you a deal if, say, you had an arrangement with one of the other providers, then they had a launch accident, as of course has happened recently, and will continue to happen in the future, and they want to convince you to change over to their service because, hey, we've got a vehicle that's available. And, so even the Chinese, who are notoriously reclusive, because the Chinese want to have a chunk of that international launch business, use the same basic interfaces as everybody else. And there's a lot of commonality also in things like how the cargo packages, the satellites and so on are encapsulated and how they're handled. Anyway, so that is that's very hopeful. And possibly as governments begin to turn more and more to commercial service providers, as we've seen with Orbital and with SpaceX resupplying the space station, that may continue further.
Okay, well, thank you for your time there.
Thank you, and I'm always glad to talk to all of you folks out there.
Okay, well.